On the morning of July 12th, 1917, the sun came up over Bisbee, Arizona, and 2,000 armed men went house to house, dragging their own neighbors into the street at gunpoint. By noon, 1,300 men were locked in cattle cars, rolling into the open desert with no food, no water, and no idea where they were going. No trial, no charges. And when it was finally over, almost no one paid for it. This is the kidnapping of an entire town, and how America forgot it ever happened. In 1917, Bisbee was not a ghost town. It was one of the richest square miles in America. The copper buried under these steep Arizona hills, just a few miles from the Mexican border, had built a full-blown city in a canyon. Brick hotels, an opera house, streetcars grinding up slopes so sharp the houses seemed stacked on top of one another. And nearly all of it, directly or indirectly, belonged to one company, Phelps Dodge. Copper was king in 1917 for a simple, brutal reason. The world was at war. Every shell casing, every mile of telegraph and telephone wire, every electrical system on every warship ran on copper, and the armies of Europe were devouring it faster than the mines could ship it. Prices soared. The mines of Bisbee ran day and night, and the profits rode the rails east by the trainload. But the men who actually went down into the ground to tear that copper out of the rock saw very little of it. And in the summer of 1917, with the company richer than it had ever been, those men finally decided they had had enough. And the most powerful corporation in Arizona decided it would not bargain with them. It would make them disappear. To understand why the men of Bisbee walked off the job, you have to understand the job. Copper mining in 1917 was hot, dark, and lethal. Men descended hundreds, sometimes thousands of feet into shafts where the temperature climbed and the air went bad, where a single spark in the wrong place or a shift in the rock could bury a crew in an instant. Cave-ins, falls, runaway ore cars, blasting accidents. The ways to die were many, and they came without warning. For this, the miners were paid wages that never seemed to keep pace with the fortunes riding up out of the shafts around them. Worse, the company used a grading system that let it pay some men less than others for the very same work, a lever to divide the workforce and keep wages down. Many of the miners were immigrants, from Mexico, from Eastern and Southern Europe, and the grading fell hardest on them. They lived in company towns, shopped in company stores, and knew that every complaint could cost them the job. It was a system built to keep men quiet, and in June of 1917, it finally failed. The union that lit the fuse was the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, the Wobblies. They were radical for their time. They wanted to organize every worker, skilled and unskilled, immigrant and native-born, into one big union, and the mine owners of the West feared and hated them for it. In Bisbee, the Wobblies found men ready to listen. Their demands, when they came, were not the stuff of revolution. They wanted an end to the grading system that paid some men less for the same labor. They wanted safer conditions underground, better ventilation, a fairer wage as copper prices and company profits shot through the roof. They wanted, in essence, a bigger share of the wealth their own bodies were pulling out of the earth. To the men in the shafts, it was common sense. To Phelps Dodge and the town's business leaders, it was a threat, not just to their profits, but to their absolute control of a town they had built and owned. And in the middle of a world war, they saw a way to turn that threat into something they could crush without mercy. In late June of 1917, the strike began. Nearly half of Bisbee's miners laid down their tools and walked out of the shafts. And here is the fact that matters most, the fact that later investigators would confirm, and the men who broke the strike would try hard to bury. The strike was peaceful. There was no sabotage. There were no bombings, no riots, no attacks on property. The strikers picketed, they gathered, they waited, but they did not turn violent. For a labor action of that era, in a mining camp that tense, it was remarkably disciplined. That should have made it harder to attack them. Instead, the company and its allies simply invented a different story. If the strikers were peaceful, then their peacefulness would be recast as a disguise, a cover for something sinister. Because there was a war on, and in wartime, you did not need a man to actually do anything wrong. You only needed to make the public believe he might. And so the men of Bisbee, who had asked for safer air and fairer pay, were about to be turned into enemies of the nation. The campaign was swift and cynical. The strikers, many of them immigrants, were branded in the newspapers and from the pulpits as pro-German agents, saboteurs, traitors, deliberately choking off the copper the American war effort depended on. It did not matter that it wasn't true. In the summer of 1917, with American boys shipping off to France and anti-German hysteria sweeping the country, the accusation didn't need evidence. It only needed repetition. A strike for better wages was reframed as an act of wartime treason, and once that frame took hold, almost anything done to the strikers could be dressed up as patriotism. This was the masterstroke. It let the men who were about to commit a mass kidnapping believe, or at least claim, that they were defending their country. The county sheriff, a former Rough Rider and Arizona Ranger named Harry Wheeler, bought the story completely, and Wheeler had the authority, the will, and soon the manpower to act on it. In the first days of July, quietly, he began to make a plan to solve the strike not with negotiation, but with railroad cars. Sheriff Harry Wheeler did not act alone, and he did not act openly. In secret, in coordination with the mining companies and the town's business elite, he assembled a private army. He deputized around 2,000 men. Company managers, foremen, merchants, and loyalists organized under names like the Citizens Protective League. They were told to arm themselves and to report before dawn. To tell friend from foe in the chaos to come, each man tied a white handkerchief or armband around his sleeve, and they were given something chillingly organized: lists, names and addresses of strikers, union men, and anyone who had spoken up for them, compiled in advance. This was not a spontaneous mob boiling over in anger. It was a planned operation, rehearsed and coordinated, aimed at a specific list of human beings. Meanwhile, on a railroad siding, cattle cars were being quietly gathered, property of the El Paso and Southwestern, a railroad tied to the very copper interests behind the whole scheme. The men of Bisbee went to sleep on the night of July 11th in an American town under the protection of the law. They would wake up to find the law itself coming through their doors with a gun. Before sunrise on July 12, 1917, the 2,000 fanned out across Bisbee and the neighboring town of Lowell. Armband on the sleeve, rifle in hand, list in pocket, they went door to door. They pulled men out of beds, out of kitchens, off the street, out of boarding houses. Strikers. Yes, but also men who had simply said the wrong thing. A shopkeeper, a lawyer, bystanders swept up because they objected to what they were watching. Most went at gunpoint, hands raised, too outnumbered to resist. But not all of it was quiet. In one doorway, the violence turned real and 2 men died. A striker and one of the deputies, killed in the same burst of gunfire. It was the only blood spilled, and it was enough to remind everyone what the rifles were for. By mid-morning, a column of some 1,300 men was being marched through the streets of their own town toward a ballpark on the edge of Warren, herded like livestock, rifles at their backs, while their wives and children watched helpless from the porches. And waiting for them at the ballpark, drawn up on the siding in the rising July heat, were the cattle cars. There were 23 of them, boxcars and cattle cars borrowed from the railroad, the floors still fouled with manure from the livestock they'd last carried. At the ballpark, the men were given a choice that was not a choice: renounce the union, go back to work on the company's terms, or get on the train. More than 1,000 of them refused to renounce anything, so they were loaded in, packed shoulder to shoulder, standing room only, in cars that turned into ovens under the desert sun. Then the doors were shut, and the train pulled out of Bisbee heading east. It rolled through the heat of the afternoon and into the night, 16 hours and nearly 200 miles, across some of the emptiest country in the Southwest. There was not enough water. There was not enough food. Men grew sick and faint in the airless dark. This was not an arrest. No one had been charged with a crime. No judge had signed a thing. Roughly 1,200 men had been kidnapped by the officials, sworn to protect them, and shipped into the desert like cargo. And near a nowhere railroad stop called Hermanos, New Mexico, the train finally stopped, the doors rolled open, and they were put out onto the bare ground. They were dumped at Hermanos with almost nothing. No shelter, little food, the desert stretching in every direction, and told never to return to Bisbee. For a day and more, 1,200 stranded men milled in the scrub with no idea what would become of them. In the end, it was the United States Army that stepped in, moving them to a camp at Columbus, New Mexico, where they were housed and fed in tents. Some stayed there for months, unable to go home, cut off from the wives and children still back in Bisbee. And back in Bisbee itself, the town had been sealed. Wheeler's men set up guards on the roads and at the trains, and for weeks they controlled who could enter or leave, interrogating travelers, keeping the deported men and organizers out. A company town had been purged of its troublemakers in a single day, and then locked down to make sure they stayed gone. The strike was broken, the copper kept flowing, and the men responsible fully expected that. Like so much else on the frontier, the whole thing would simply be swallowed by the desert and forgotten. For a while it looked like they were right. There was outrage. President Wilson appointed a federal commission to investigate, and it reached a blunt conclusion. The Bisbee Deportation had been wholly illegal, with no authority in any law, state or federal. It was, in plain language, a mass kidnapping carried out by a sheriff. And then came the part that should stay with you. Charges were brought. Harry Wheeler and the organizers were hauled into court, and the cases collapsed. When it reached the highest levels, the ruling was that no federal law had actually been broken, because Congress had never imagined a crime quite like this one, and so there was no statute that fit. The state prosecutions went nowhere against defendants who were the town's most powerful men, tried before juries of their neighbors. In the end, not one person was convicted. Not one man spent a single day in prison for loading 1,200 human beings into cattle cars and abandoning them in the desert. Phelps Dodge had broken the strike, kept its copper, and kept its town. Today, Bisbee is a pretty place, an artist's town where tourists wander the old streets and take the mine tour. And almost none of them are ever told that on one July morning, this town put 1,300 of its own men in cattle cars and got away with it clean. Some frontiers were never really tamed. They just learned to wear a badge.